what drives everything in the electronic systems that people put in place in healthcare, or what enables everything, is how accurate and meaningful is your underlying data. Unfortunately, now I think we've still got some work to do to make the most important data for both MA and Part D to work well. That is, we've got electronic records now, we should be able to incorporate lab test results. If we were designing MA and Part D now, that's the kind of data we'd be using. We still don't have that in place, and that's, I think, a critical fix for the future of both MA and Part D, and frankly, for, getting the high value in our healthcare system.
This is DC EKG, exploring the intersection of politics and healthcare by diagnosing Washington and prescribing solutions. We take a deep dive into the legislation, regulation, and innovation impacting policymakers, providers, and patients. Now, America's health policy expert, Joe Grogan.
Welcome back to DC EKG. I'm your host, Joe Grogan, and I'm joined today by Mark McClellan, the only person to run both FDA and CMS, which is a great person to have on because FDA and CMS are in the news virtually. Well, they are not virtually. They are in the news every day for anybody who's paying any attention to healthcare, and frequently on the national news, they're leading the news. So, Mark, thanks so much for joining.
Hey, great to be with you, and a lot of things going on in FDA, CMS, and all the aspects of healthcare and biomedical innovation that they touch.
Right. So, Mark, before we get into it and I start asking you questions, just tell the audience, the listeners, what you do on your day-to-day job. And if you want to give a little bit of your background, that's great too. For some people who may be living under a rock may not know your background.
Well, Joe, as you know, I have a background in medicine, internal medicine, and actually in economics too. And that's what not because of a clear career plan, but it was that combination that got me started into some jobs in government as well. Actually, my first job in government was in the Clinton administration, the Treasury Department, and then went from there to White House staff and Council Economic Advisor staff in the Bush 43 White House, the beginning of the administration, and then FDA and CMS. Since then, I've had the privilege of continuing to work in academic settings and also advising private sector companies. I'm on the board of Cigna and Johnson & Johnson, for example. But my day job now is running a university-wide institute at Duke University called the Margolis Institute for Health Policy that aims to bring together researchers who are very knowledgeable about important health policy issues that often come to us from experience with CMS or FDA or in other very policy-oriented jobs, and are good at doing analysis and keeping up with what's going on and having knowledge and interactions with people involved in federal, state, global policymaking, and combine them with the research capabilities of a major academic institution, Duke University, that has expertise in not just issues related to medicine, but public policy, business, engineering, really all the fields that need to come together to hopefully inform and support better policymaking for better health and healthcare and the value of the medical services that we're getting.
So out of curiosity, when you were at Treasury in the Clinton administration, was that under Larry Summers, or who was running Treasury at the time?
It was Bob Rubin was the secretary, and Larry
right.
Summers was the deputy. And you may remember back then, Bob previously had been in the White House role, kind of overseeing economic policy, so very trusted by the president. And I think Treasury's job, certainly my part of it, was just being involved in policy making from an economic soundness, budget, those kinds of considerations. Not a job that, like any of these, not jobs that you apply for, but
right.
Really was great working for him. He's a terrific boss. President George W. Bush was also a terrific boss, and different parties, but a lot of commitment to trying to bring sound economics, business perspectives to achieving our policy goals.
And then at Bush, who was running NEC when you took over the health portfolio there?
Larry Lindsay. So it was right at the beginning of the
Right.
administration. I had just gone back was on the faculty at Stanford at the time. I'd taken leave when I was at Treasury. Had just gone back there and was, kind of moving forward, getting tenure, publishing papers, things like that. And you just can't make this stuff up. I ended up
Right.
helping with a transition project. Remember, that was a shortened transition with the Supreme Court decision and hanging chads in Florida and all of that stuff. But the president-elect really wanted to announce a right off the bat drug discount program help for especially low-income seniors, like January 21st. So what was supposed to be sort of a few weeks of commuting and helping with that project turned into 6+ years in the Bush 43 administration, working with a really good boss.
Right. Okay. So before we leave because I think this is fascinating, and I think people. So you were at NEC for how long before you got nominated to go to FDA?
A couple of years. So that was 2000, beginning of the administration, 2001, the late 2002, I went to FDA.
Okay. And then just to frame it a little bit, second term, you went to CMS. Is that correct?
Well, it's actually before the second term. So one of the big priorities for the president when he got elected, you may remember, was enacting a drug benefit for seniors and doing it in a way that encouraged competition and private sector innovation, public-private collaboration. So I'd intended to work a lot on that while I was on the White House staff. Of course, you don't control the world when you're in these jobs. Events, particularly 9/11, the anthrax attacks, really changed the focus as the president brought sort of whole of government approach to increasing our biosecurity and lots of health issues involved with all of that. At the same time, though, his priorities, he tried to advance those as well, including Medicare reform. So I stayed involved in that, went to FDA, and it's an amazing place to work. It's like the best job in the world from the standpoint of, the world's best fire hose, all of the evidence, new developments in all aspects of science that matter for human health and turn into drugs and other products, better nutrition, et cetera. So that was a great job. But when the Medicare Modernization Act passed at the end of 2003, the president asked me to move over to CMS to help implement that, and that was in early 2004, and was there through then the first year of implementation of Part D in 2006. So that was it was that legislative achievement that led to my switch in jobs.
That's so funny because your tenure at FDA looms large. My recollection, your memory plays tricks. My recollection was that you were there longer, but you were only at FDA for how long?
A couple of years, yeah.
Okay.
Just around a couple of years. So during that time, we did try to get a lot of things moving. We had, I think, the first commissioner's briefing on Bayesian statistical methods, putting together evidence, not just from single clinical trials on their own, but sort of the whole sum total of knowledge from multiple trials, real world evidence, et cetera. That's eventually led to some FDA guidance and hopefully some changes in practice. With Janet Woodcock's leadership, we implemented what's called the FDA Critical Path Initiative around finding sort of critical choke points where drug development, medical product development was slowing down, and having the public-private efforts focused on that. Things like advanced good manufacturing processes, steps to reduce repeat cycles and FDA reviews, and generally try to make the review process and interactions with industry more efficient, generic drugs, things like that.
It's amazing. Yeah, that must be why my memory, because I remember being in meetings with you at the end of the first term. You probably don't remember me being there.
Yeah.
And I remember you were running CMS at the time, but the amount of time that you just had a huge effect. I mean, on healthcare policy with that run.
Well, nice of you to say. I think one of the better things I did was give Scott Gottlieb his first job in government as a special advisor to me to spend time with the career staff on important issues where the science was changing, the regulations need to change to make sure we could develop a deep understanding of the best ways to move things forward. And he certainly was an incredibly good student with all of that, and has gone on to some amazing impacts.
Yeah, he's a force multiplier because he doesn't sleep. He doesn't sleep, so that's always good to have him around. Okay, so sorry, this isn't an oral history, but it could be. But okay, you were there at the creation of Part D.
Yeah.
You saw the whole thing from passage, development, transition, the president's announcement from the White House, FDA, and then CMS. Secretary Leavitt was at that point when took over in the beginning of the second term. Tommy Thompson in the first term, he had been instrumental, key to getting it passed.
Yeah.
Can you just talk a little bit about that creation of Part D, the vision for Part D? And after we talk a little bit about that, I want to get a sense, your diagnosis of where we are now with Part D after all these years. Obviously, there were a lot of people who didn't vote for Part D, who said it was going to fail. In its aftermath, there were a lot of ideological arguments that I think people held on to one way or the other on the conservative side and the liberal side, that they never revisited the evidence. So, but maybe you talk a little bit about that creation of Part D.
I will. This is turning out to be an oral history, though. Just want to say that. But as you noted, this was a bill that passed with a really close vote that the House had to hold open for like several hours on the floor right around the Thanksgiving recess. And it did have bipartisan support, but I'd say the most important parts of it were from the moderate wing of the Democratic Party at the time, so John Breaux and people like that, and then Bill Thomas and a pretty solid group of Republicans. But on the more fiscal conservative end of the Republican Party at that time, there was definitely opposition. And on the more liberal Democratic side, which wanted a more generous benefit, and maybe one delivered, not so much with private sector emphasis, but maybe more direct government negotiation. There's some disagreement too. I would say, since we are in a little bit of oral history mode, Senator Ted Kennedy was incredibly helpful in getting this drug benefit through. He ended up not voting for the bill in the end because it included, not as generous of a benefit as he wanted. It included things like not just creating the Medicare Advantage program, but also tax savings accounts, HSAs, things like that. But he helped get the vote to the floor in the Senate by voting for cloture. And for those of you who follow the process, that the 60 votes, he helped make it possible to get a vote with less than 60, with enough Republicans and Democrats behind it in the Senate to bring it into law. That was at the end of 2003. The start date for Medicare Advantage was 2005. The start date for the drug benefit, which is a completely new market. We did not have a standalone market for prescription drug coverage in the country at that time. We certainly had prescription drug coverage everywhere except Medicare and Medicaid programs and commercial insurance, et cetera. But this was a new thing, especially the standalone notion of it. And back then, Medicare Advantage plans are prevalent today, private plans competing in Medicare, but they weren't at that time. Very small fraction of the total had been heading on the way out of the financial and regulatory structures behind them at the time. So the simple task was, well, let's get this up and running. And I have to say, it was a huge amount of support that brought this together. You mentioned two successive HHS secretaries who were deeply involved in moving it forward. We had a cross HHS and broader government collaboration with other agencies, NIH, FDA leadership providing some expertise at that time. CMS had no pharmacists on staff and limited amount of drug expertise, so the cross-agency help was was really useful. We had hiring authority, special hiring authority to bring in new kinds of expertise quickly to stand it up. Also working with Social Security Administration, since they had a lot of the data systems that we were going to need to help get drugs available. But Joe, there were just a whole set of problems that needed to be solved. I remember getting there pretty much day one with a list from our very capable career staff at the time on everything that needed to be addressed. These are things like, well, how do you get all of the state Medicaid drug coverage programs and the people on them, which are people with limited incomes and often very complex needs, where they miss a drug prescription and it's a serious health issue. How do we solve that? How do we get a drug benefit that's involves lots of drug plans, a kind of complex benefit design, deductible, some coverage, that famous donut hole, and catastrophic protection, with competing plans to be available and usable when any senior shows up at a pharmacy, any of the 50,000 plus pharmacies in the U.S., maybe with their Medicare card, maybe just with their ID saying, I'm Joe Smith and I'm on Medicare and I've got drug coverage. How do you enable the pharmacy to ping whether that person really is in not only in Medicare, but which drug plan they're on, where they are in their deductible, copay, whatever part of the benefit, and is the drug that they got prescribed covered? If it is, what's the copay? If it's not, what's the alternative? There was no system in place for doing that in real time, so much across the healthcare system. And then there was also the issue of, can this market even work? A lot of prescription drug use at the time was for chronic conditions. That was what had really driven the creation of the benefit. Things like drugs for lowering lipids, starting to get drugs for more advanced drugs for cardiometabolic conditions, for behavioral conditions. A lot of Medicare beneficiaries with HIV, where new treatments were coming along they needed to use chronically. These are very predictable kinds of expenditures, and as you know, insurance markets where enrollment was voluntary, as this was, don't often work well if there's this problem of potential adverse selection risks. It drives down the quality of the benefit, and that would defeat, or if you impose a lot of requirements, nobody participates. So we had to work all that in less than 2 years. And it was a real intense public-private effort to do that. There's a couple of things that really mattered. Number one, we worked with career staff to get out regulations on all of these key questions early. So this was remember, this is 2004. What was going on then? Well, in a presidential election, it was at least going into the election pretty contested. So to the president's credit, he backed us completely on getting out all of these details in the regs right in the run up to the election. You're like, potentially controversial issues like formularies and the ability of plans to use coverage restrictions or prior auth. On the flip side, maybe some requirements for coverage that could potentially add to costs in areas where we're really worried about adverse selection. And I know the usual political view is don't put all those details out close to an election, they'll be misused. The president's view was, hey, I told people I was going to run on creating this benefit, I created it, I'm going to get criticized no matter what we do, what you put in this reg or not, coming into the election, and at least they're talking about my issue. So that it was very useful for us getting not only a lot of good feedback, but we actually hired some of the most critical commenters that we had on the reg to bring in. It's like, okay, that's a hard problem. You have some good ideas on it. Come fix it.
Wait, give me an example. You don't need to mention a name, but people on in academia that were saying this is done.
More from some academic experts, but yeah, people from the pharmacy community who really knew how pharmacy worked, people from the actuarial community who were thinking of challenges and how, a drug, certain kinds of coverage restrictions or features would actually play out in a competitive market with voluntary participation, technical experts around how to put the systems together. The other critical thing that I wanted to mention was because there was like no system in place for the just the accurate, reliable, immediate data exchange that was needed to make this work. And this is before AI and all that kind of stuff. We set some conditions early on, so we knew this was a problem for the industry, both the insurance industry, the pharmacy industry, the pharmacists, that they need to come together and come up with a technical solution that allows frictionless data exchange on all of the critical data for success of this program. And I already talked about what some of those elements were. And that actually led to SureScripts, a system that is in place today. I know we had a lot of trouble with like data sharing and some aspects of electronic records, but we don't when it comes to the information that's needed to do eligibility for Medicare drug coverage and where you are in the copay deductible and what the alternative drug that is covered would be for you, if not the one that your doctor prescribed in every pharmacy in the United States. That's still a working foundation. I wish that concept had been built out more for more of our electronic data exchange, but that was a great example of a fast public-private solution to a critical implementation problem.
So you left CMS in what time frame?
Late 2006. I mean, to make sure that the program got off the ground. Of course, when it started, Congress in its wisdom, and it's kind of our fault. We should have thought about this, but it started on January 1st, 2006. Probably not the best day. You want a drug benefit to kick in with enrollment going up until December 31st, the day before. CMS has changed that now, so the open enrollment period ends considerably before that, so there's time to make sure everybody's well connected. So there were definitely some bumps at the start. We worked through those. Again, great effort by the CMS career team combined with rolling up sleeves. Let's solve this attitude with the states, with the pharmacy community. So I wanted to stay on long enough to make sure this was secure and that MA was getting off the ground effectively. But I did also want to see my kids, and I was also looking at our home equity line of credit going up.
I've been there. Okay, so looking back on it, okay, so you leave in 2006. Let's go to say 2016, 10 years later. Is there a decision you wish had been made differently at that point, like 10 years after? You mentioned one, the launch date or the end of the enrollment period. Is there anything that you guys could have done differently that might have made it work better, or you wish it had made the program a little bit more durable, or a regret that you've got it with the benefit of hindsight?
Yeah, two things. The thing about healthcare is that you don't necessarily know exactly how it's going to change, but you do know it's going to keep changing. The technologies are going to keep getting better, especially on the biomedical capability side, but also on the data infrastructure technology side. When the benefit was designed, it included a lot of reinsurance. So just to keep, to help stabilize the market at the beginning, the federal government paid for the vast majority of the so-called catastrophic part of the drug benefit. And that was an essential feature to stabilize the market, get people familiar with data, with utilization patterns, and turn insurance companies, Joe, as you know, are not good with uncertainty. They're good with risk, but it's critical that they're able to predict it, to be able to price premiums in a stable way, and hopefully include everyone, all the drugs that needed to be covered. By 2016, people were talking about like, hey, the program's well established, succeeding in getting drugs to all patients, but the part of the program where the costs are growing the fastest was the catastrophic part of the drug benefit. Now, partly that's technology driven, a lot of specialty drugs that have been developed since then. But partly that's also driven by, the government paying 80% of the cost there, and beneficiaries also having to pay, 5% at the catastrophic levels. That was starting to add
Right.
up too. So there started to be a bipartisan process around that time to, how you modernize the benefit. Basically, the idea being put more risk on the plans to help give them both the financial incentive to keep costs down and maybe negotiate a bit more aggressively up in that high end of the of drug spending and drug pricing, but also make sure there's still accountability for getting better patient experience, the outcome measures and so forth that are part of Part D. And that ended up turning into legislation that was enacted as part of the IRA in
Yeah.
2021, right?
Yeah.
But it was coupled with some other changes in Medicare and the sort of the direct government negotiation program. I think putting all those together in retrospect probably could have used more of a transition from sort of the low levels of risk that the Part D plans were facing for the catastrophic segment of the benefit before to the very high levels of risk now in that post IRA legislation, especially since it came with some other changes in tightening MA payments and
Right.
adding in this new kind of price negotiation. And I think that's been a bit of a challenge, especially for the standalone Part D plans. They're facing a new high level of uncertainty is sort of the usual rule. You're going to make these markets work if you can turn uncertainty into predictable risk. And I think we're still working through all of that with all the other changes happening in MA at the same time.
So just to be clear, you would have been open to restructuring the benefit, but maybe in a more
Yeah,
gradual fashion and allow the marketplace to adjust.
that's right. And maybe in conjunction with some other steps, especially in the Medicare Advantage program and in modernizing the original Medicare structure too. Remember, the other big feature of the Medicare Modernization Act was Medicare Advantage, and that program, very pleased to say, grew steadily from then on, with the systems that we had put in place. But just to give you another example there, very critical to both Part D and Medicare Advantage was the notion of risk adjustment, that there's an individual level benefit with people having voluntary choice that enables them to make a decision whether or not they want to participate at all, and also is intended to promote competition by letting them choose the plan that would be best for them. At the time when we set up the program, asking the staff and talking to experts, the best data that we had to predict individual risk came from fee-for-service insurance claims, because that's what Medicare was. It's a big program that was
Yeah.
providing healthcare coverage for people who really needed it, and it was and aimed to be very accurate at fee-for-service diagnosis payment, fee-for-service diagnosis-based payment. What really mattered before Part D and MA started was what the service being billed for was. So we had like a really good system of CPT codes that could be audited and so forth. Did the patient get this procedure? And that's what Medicare did. There were also diagnosis codes reported on those claims, and they didn't come from, we didn't have electronic records at the time. They came for stuff that the doctors or their admin staff wrote down out of the medical records, and it didn't matter that much for payment. What mattered was the CPT code a lot more. But then when this program was implemented, those reported manual diagnoses started to matter a lot, because it's
Yeah.
those diagnoses that determine, if you have kidney failure, your utilization in Medicare is going to be a whole lot higher. So we want to pay those plans that are taking those patients more, because those are the patients that can benefit the most from care coordination, innovative benefit design, what Medicare Advantage
Yeah.
was meant to be all about. Similarly, those diagnoses mattered for Part D. We also started using some drug prescribing in the Part D adjustment system. The problem was that by 2016 and certainly today, we've seen what happened since. We knew back at the time we were implementing this law that electronic health records were coming. The legislation, as you know, doesn't happen overnight. The idea is, at least for these big issues, take a while to percolate, and then their opportunity comes along, like these, updates of the Medicare drug benefit ended up being packaged into the IRA. Here, what became high tech, this $50 billion investment in electronic health records, was enacted a few years after the MMA. And the problem there was that the electronic health records that got adopted, unsurprisingly, were adopted in a way that supported more efficient billing. They're also meant, and they do support better care. But it created a whole infrastructure around, well, can we find diagnoses or evidence somewhere in the medical record for diagnoses, or it could be added to the medical record through, like, having a nurse go visit someone at their home to capture the diagnosis and get it reported in, because that leads to more payment in Part D, but especially MA. And the problem there is that, what an electronic health record should be is about getting the most accurate risk information, the lab test results, an accurate measure of BMI, the status of a patient's, cancer response or disease severity. That's what we wanted. What we got was, instead, we got some of that, but we also got a lot of administrative attention, infrastructure, and now AI-backed tools to optimize reimbursement, to find diagnoses and so forth. Not necessarily, unfortunately, to do something about it. So that's something else that needs to be modernized. And so we're back to that principle I talked about with SureScripts. What drives everything in the electronic systems that people put in place in healthcare, or what enables everything, is how accurate and meaningful is your underlying data. And unfortunately now, I think we've still got some work to do to make the most important data for both MA and Part D to work well. That is, we got electronic records now. We should be able to incorporate, lab test results, not like some manual, diagnosis, which may or may not show up for whether a patient has chronic kidney disease, but like, the actual EGFR, the lab tests that tell you, when you repeat them, what, reliably what a patient's kidney function is and how it's progressing over time. If we were designing MA in Part D now, that's the kind of data we'd be using. We still don't have that in place. And that's, I think, a critical fix for the future of both MA and Part D, and frankly, for, getting the high value in our healthcare system.
So that's fascinating, because I did not expect that's where the conversation was going to go. But
well, I'm glad we have these interviews.
No, I mean, that's really interesting, because I've been thinking, I guess when I started to become aware of this, I was thinking the problem is the hospital is the customer, and the hospital just wants more money, right? They need a tool that's going to allow them to bill as much as they can.
Well, and in defense of hospitals, if you give them 340B payments and sort of, payments that are tied to spending more on more expensive drugs, that's what you're going to, unfortunately, what you tend to get.
Yeah. Yeah. But if the patient was the customer, you would have had a different medical record. And if the doctor was the customer, you would have had a different medical record focus than where we are now. And then to your point, I was just speaking with somebody who's big in, private equity out in California, and saying the number one deal flow for AI in healthcare that he's seeing is how to, you said optimize billing. If you say maximize billing, then everybody's going to jail. So you don't say that. So
I used a cleaned up term, but yeah.
But that and then I know I've heard Klomp talk about this, how nervous they are about fraud, and the way that AI can build these records now that's impossible, or very, very difficult to spot whether or not it's actually a fraudulent claim or not.
Yeah, I would say, and I know one of the things we wanted to talk about, at least generally, was sort of FDA CMS collaboration. So just to give people a flavor, maybe we do a whole nother session, if you ever have me back sometime, talking about like AI and healthcare and supporting these kinds of models. But just a little bit of a flavor of that, and an example of what I think is the right direction, but we've got a long way to go, is CMS is now trying to start paying for what I think they're calling digital forward providers, Medicare Part B providers that offer kind of disease and chronic care management support direct to Medicare beneficiaries for these big common chronic diseases or the core of the MAHA and, understandable concerns about the high chronic disease burden in our country, despite, all these technologies that we have, including both expensive, relatively speaking, drugs like GLP-1s and inexpensive drugs like antihypertensives and lipid lowering agents that are now, very dirt cheap, just a few dollars per prescription. Often, both of those not being, really integrated into better care models. So this is an effort to really try to drive AI forward in doing it. And to CMS's credit, the payments in this program, well, first off, they're not very large. There have been some complaints about that. This is called the access model. I forget, Joe, what exactly that stands for, but it is competing, starting in July, digital forward companies that are doing things like cardio, kidney, metabolic management, helping people use drugs, lifestyle changes. And when I say drugs, I don't just mean GLP-1s. I mean, some of these other, lower cost drugs as well for hypertension, et cetera, where that can't be managed with, diet and lifestyle supports alone, but also some, innovative technology enabled supports for that, because technology can do a lot of things to meet people where they are that doctors can't. And, traditional 10-minute or tech forward solutions are being paid basically on an outcome basis. It's a per person, per beneficiary payment per month. Half of it essentially tied, and it's not very big, half of it tied to the beneficiary participating in the program, but the main payments tied to reliably measuring the health risks that really matter for these patients. So there's things like an auditable, verifiable BMI measure, and there are ways to do that through technology now or at home. They're more convenient than kind of going into the doctor's office and using like validated, hopefully more validated digital tools in the future to make it even more home-based, and lab test results like lipid levels or hemoglobin A1C levels. That's what you want, right? That's what a clinician would want if they're trying to, on their dashboard, if they're managing a patient. And they only get paid if they significantly improve those measures and ideally get to the evidence-based guideline results for those patients. There's a similar program for, mild to moderate musculoskeletal conditions, which are a huge part of Medicare spending and a huge part of inefficient care, and also for behavioral health conditions, anxiety, depression, where the main measures are these validated approaches to patient functional status. That's what really matters for health. So can you measure that reliably over time and then improve it over time? That's the basis for payment. So that's the foundation that I mean when I say, if we want to really encourage electronic records to capture and exchange and make very usable easily for clinicians what really matters for them and their patients, make this available to patients. Remember, this is a beneficiary facing program. That's what we need. And it's going to be a challenge, I think, Joe, to, CMS has a really extensive effort set up around advancing this health technology ecosystem for frictionless data exchange of this critical information for managing patients, improving outcomes, and creating value and rewarding companies that create value in healthcare. But it's probably like our example that we've already talked about. All those data flows aren't going to happen easily on day one. And so there's a lot of attention now and a lot will be needed going forward to get that implemented effectively, and then extend those same kinds of models, those same kinds of approaches, measuring this critical source data that's really that's really important for patients and for their providers to succeed in better care, extending that into our MA program, extending that into Medicare. On the traditional Medicare side, we started the early so-called accountable care organization program. So that's a big part of traditional original Medicare now. All those programs don't have access and aren't built on this very reliable data exchange platform. So I see that as a big challenge, but one where CMS is taking steps now. And at the same time, we also want AI-enabled tools that work. FDA has created a complementary pilot program called TEMPO. And I do remember what this stands for because it's exactly what I was talking about: technology-enabled meaningful patient outcomes. So FDA does not have a clear and easy review and update process for AI-enabled any kind of medical devices,
Right.
because you can approve them, but all the interesting things are going to happen after they get into actual use, and there can be drift and other challenges. There can also be big improvements in how well they work. So how do we measure that effectively? Well, it's certainly a big help if CMS is paying for auditable, accurate, reliable information on exactly the outcomes that we want the digital, these new medical, digitally enabled, AI enabled tech products and services to produce.
Okay, let me ask you this question. If you got the call tomorrow to go in, either as HHS Secretary, or let's say I want to put you in as HHS Secretary. Let's suppose you're going in. As we're having this conversation, Commissioner McCary has resigned, so
Yeah.
FDA is going to need a vision for the future.
Yeah.
As far as FDA CMS collaboration, you're the only person that's run both agencies.
Yeah.
Is this where you would concentrate, or where would you concentrate? I mean, the big example for me that drives me crazy is the second guess, when CMS second guesses FDA's scientific judgment about safety and efficacy.
Yeah, and that's in things like coverage with evidence and stuff like that. Yeah.
Amyloid plaque inhibitor context, and they put all sorts of conditions for use on this class, and basically under Secretary Becerra disparaged FDA scientific judgment. You see a payer move, frankly, to discredit breakthrough therapies and accelerated approval and surrogate endpoints. But it sounds like this is an area of positive collaboration that CMS and FDA should focus on. But I'm intrigued in what you would focus on, having had both jobs.
Yeah, it's I think that looking ahead, FDA CMS interaction is just going to increase. I gave the example of these AI technologies where most of the stuff you're going to learn isn't going to happen just by definition until it's on the market and being used more widely. Can CMS set up payment mechanisms that don't slow down treatments that FDA has found to be safe and effective in the sort of pre-approval studies that they're able to do? But to CMS's point, there's a lot of low value use of technology, just going beyond drugs. Back to the examples we were talking about, a lot of surgical procedures like joint replacements and so forth that could be avoided. And so CMS is undertaking some big efforts to try to advance payment models that support providers working together with plans to improve, and beneficiaries to improve outcomes. That needs a lot of evidence to help drive it that often isn't available in just a preclinical study. So I think the most promising opportunities for CMS FDA collaboration are not, sort of second guessing each other, but having processes that they can make clear and available to product developers of what happens and why, so there is a smooth process to approval and beyond. Some more positive examples of this under the CMS coverage of evidence development policy, which I think when used well can make a big difference, includes transaortic valve replacements. This is a new technology at the time for avoiding a massive open chest surgical procedure by using a catheter to replace a heart valve. This was now a decade plus ago, and it seemed like amazing technology at the time. We've progressed so much further beyond that, but that product was approved with a fairly narrow label and with a very limited number of Medicare beneficiaries included, and also basically being performed only in these specialized clinical academic type settings where you have people, surgeons who are doing a lot of them. So big questions for CMS. Can this work in elderly patients, especially that have comorbidities or more severe disease or other characteristics that weren't represented in the clinical trials? Can they work? Can these be done by cardiologists or the cardiac procedure specialists? I should say, not cardiac surgeons, since this is not a surgical procedure. It's a trans catheter procedure, who may not have as high of volumes. And CMS ended up then setting up coverage, I think, was a bit more broad than it would have been otherwise, along with some data collection to figure out the answers to those questions. And sure enough, it turns out that, the volume of procedures needed is not as high as the original clinical trial would have suggested. Turns out that these devices, not surprisingly, get better over time, so lower complication rates and so net benefits for more patients. More of that is going to have to happen, I think, Joe. We just had our annual healthcare conference for Duke Margolis a couple of days ago. I encourage people to look it up. It was our 10th anniversary, and so instead of looking back and saying, "Oh, we've done some great stuff over the last 10 years, look at us," we want to look forward. Like, what are the big challenges ahead, and how are we going to meet them? And we've talked about some of them: AI, and making sure it's focused on financial support around better results for patients, and is working off the best possible data in collaboration with patients and their healthcare providers to do it. But another area is, I guess, what you call one and done curative treatment. So one of our panelists was Jennifer Doudna, won the Nobel Prize for CRISPR in 2020, and it's amazing technology. It's starting to change the lives of many kids, but
Yeah.
boy, we are not there in terms of a smooth process for coverage and payment, despite FDA approval. It's going slow. Our entire healthcare system is not set up to do that. David Bradler used the analogy of you can rent your health, which is what we do now with a lot of these chronic treatments, or you can buy it up front, but that's a whole different financing model. Dave Ricks talked about some gene editing applications, not just for kids with these rare life-threatening or life-ending diseases who now have the potential to live a long, full life. And we're starting to see that happen, but not at the pace I'd like to see. Gene editing for gene factors that influence high lipid rates. So you can take PCSK9 drugs for the rest of your life, or you can have like one procedure done and never have to think about it again. That is going to be but it's a lot of work to show safety and effectiveness. And boy, you absolutely positively need long-term follow-up on these patients, not only for, confirming that the effect is persistent, but also this is gene editing. So it's people's genomes, and there are real worries for understandable reasons about potential side effects there, like cancers downstream. So these are all solvable problems, but they're not solvable with the current policies and care models and CMS, FDA, sort of data and evidence development activities that we have in place today.
First of all, amen to all that. But and I love the fact that you guys are focused on paying for these treatments. I mean, we couldn't pay for the hepatitis C treatments when they came out. It almost, the payers said it because it wasn't set up for cures, and they were relatively inexpensive compared to $1.5 million, $3 million for genetic treatment. And of course, the coverage with evidence development and restrictions on use for the amyloid plaque inhibitors, a lot of that was driven by cost concerns, which ultimately didn't materialize. But TAVR, to me, is the peril of CED, because
because now it's still sticking around, and
exactly. I mean, it's one of the most amazing innovations in cardiac care of all time, and there's tons of evidence out there. It's been out there for longer than a decade. Could you know more? Of course, you can always know more, but now you've got to balance access with these continued restrictions and keeping them in academic medical societies. And I gotta say, as somebody who's had friends and family members who've benefited from it, and also would have benefited from it. My mother needed one when she got sick and passed away over a decade ago, but she was waiting for for TAVR to come,
as we hadn't done those expansions yet.
It hadn't been available at the time. It really troubles me, and I'd love to see CMS focus where you are on the future of CED and these and Congress, because you're going to need congressional action in order to accommodate payment for these things, and we are woefully unprepared for them.
Well, you asked earlier about, hypothetically, if I was to get a call about HHS Secretary, which thankfully for everyone I don't think that is in the cards, but what would be important to do, addressing exactly the issue that you described, which is how do we get evidence developed and collected without burdensome, registry collection processes. The same thing goes, by the way, for clinical trials and clinical development generally in the U.S. It is very expensive. It requires like parallel data collection. And now there's strong bipartisan interest in doing something about that, in part because the rest of the world is kind of, especially China, is like plowing ahead on ways that are overcoming our clinical development. I'd say this applies to the post-market setting as well. And there are some promising steps, including some that CMS announced just recently, to try to facilitate more interaction between CMS staff and FDA staff and product developers to have this very clear path and hopefully some seamless, easier data collection. Also at our conference this week, Representative Jake Alkencloth, Representative Morgan Griffith are introducing some or developing some legislation to try to fix these problems, which now are urgent, and that is an area where there's not a lot that can be done in bipartisan legislation in Congress, but something about sort of better evidence and making clinical development faster is an area, and I think that can apply as well, Joe, to better use of evidence to support doctors, patients, help people like, sorry about your mom, the technology was and the availability was not as fast as we'd like to have it. That's just a reminder of why this should be absolute number one top issue. Now that our technology is getting better, there's so much evidence on how we could deliver care more efficiently, have the capacity to keep improving that evidence. Let's take advantage of that. The last thing I want to mention, sorry to give our conference so much plugs in answering this question. For like HHS, what did HHS Secretary do? Chris Klomp was our closeout speaker. He is working on a lot. He is in the jobs like this, working on a lot of these issues of trying to make Medicare work better, Medicare Advantage work better, and paying attention to the kinds of things we've been talking about today, thankfully. He talked about something I think is very important for getting predictable, meaningful changes accomplished and making healthcare better. And that is the importance of engaging the private sector, working across party lines where possible. And there are some possibilities in these areas. I just gave you one example, but also relying on the very knowledgeable career staff that you have and augmenting it with a knowledgeable team from outside, like CMS has done under Mehmet Oz's leadership. And people might not agree with everything that CMS is doing. I know, we could talk about MFN and things too, but I think there's even a sort of a positive step there, Joe, in terms of, and we've talked about this a bit before, negotiation that does two things. One is actually does raise prices to fairer levels in other countries while bringing them down here. And look at the US-UK, trade agreement around drug pricing that came out of that there. The second is changing that model. So getting career staff engaged, figuring out how to really do it, but changing that model that you talked about, which is everybody's expectation now in the US for a new product is you have to introduce it at this very high list price, because our healthcare system is just not designed, the prior auth processes, the delivery processes, to adapt to those new technologies fast. One thing that the GLP-1 negotiation did, and Dave Ricks talked about this at our conference too, was it intended to bring down the cost, the net price to patients and to the healthcare system of the GLP-1 drugs in conjunction with expanding coverage. So these are relatively low cost products to make another copy of, once you've done all the IP and investment to get to that point. It does seem like low P times high Q could create the right revenues and incentives for product developers and create more access, and most importantly, better health outcomes, fewer complications at the same time. CMS is trying really hard to implement a model called balance to make that coverage, a reality in Medicare Part D, piloting it over the next couple of years, it's been really hard because there's a lot of uncertainty about, wow, we don't see drugs coming in at this low price that early, and are we still going to be, what are the right utilization tools to do, and how do we have accountability for, not some of the inappropriate or some of the, I should say, uneven uses of GLP-1 drugs that we've seen with many people, discontinuing soon, probably in part because the costs are so high. So these kinds of issues of how do you create more certainty around markets and Part D plans that do what we would really like them to do, those are still with us right now as we try to make these transitions. And back to your point, better evidence is just so helpful for getting that right. And I hope we can, step up and do that. I know there's a lot of career staff at FDA and CMS who want to make that happen too.
Well, this was fascinating. This was a tour de force, and we covered. We could have done this. This could have been 3 hours easy. Thank you so much. I'd love to have you back. I mean, there's a number of topics we could go deeper.
Thanks, Joe. I really enjoy working with you, and thanks for I'm glad this EKG wasn't like a STEMI or something like that, but hopefully one that'll bring your heart rate down. And it's great being with you.
Thanks so much for joining, Mark. I appreciate it.
Take care.
For more conversations that get to the heart of healthcare policy, follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. DC EKG is executive produced by John C.Z. Swartacki and sponsored by Survivors for Solutions, a Stay on Course Studios production.